Today's guest is Tanner Wallace, and Tanner is a trauma coach. To sum it up real easily, she specializes in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's called CPTSD. It's kind of a tongue twister. But in this episode, she really goes into detail about what that is, gives examples. We talk about how she got into this work. It was through self-healing. And I think it'll help a lot of people who listen. And so I just was fascinated. I always love learning new things. And when I learn new things, I like to share them. And so she also has this way about her that is so peaceful and calm. And she made me feel so at ease. And not that I always feel easy with my guests, but I just felt like when I was done, it was just like, ah, you know, how you after you finish a massage or something. But that, yeah, she is shares her experience. She's very open, and I enjoyed it immensely. And with no further ado, here she is. Welcome to another episode of Living Your Sparked Second Half Life. And today I have with me Tanner Wallace, and she's somebody I noticed on Instagram, and she has a business that helps a very important niche, I think, a very important part of the population. So welcome to the program, Tanner.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always nice to be on the other side, like
Yeah.
not behind a microphone, but
Oh,
actually be the guest. Yes, I'm glad to
yeah.
be here.
Yeah. So you have a podcast,
I have a
and
podcast. Yeah.
and it's called, we have to say that up front.
Well, it's been called many different things over the years. We've sort of in this settling period of it's just called Held by Tanner.
Oh, okay.
It's the
Okay.
latest
Yeah.
iteration.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, but yeah, so so I've been following you. I'm surprised I didn't know. I probably did know a while ago that you had a podcast, but I forgot. But yeah, I know you have a program, and what you do is amazing. But of course, what you do is based on your own personal journey. And so can you start to talk about that? I love a lot of my guests, have developed businesses to help people around trauma or some major pivot, some like health crisis, or some miserable job that they were in, and just this enlightenment that came upon them. But for you, I mean, I think you were really in a deep, deep, dark place. And so I think what you do is so valuable. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on. And so I'm sure somebody will connect with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think, getting older is very interesting, as you know. I think when we're younger, we, are a lot of us are on kind of a script. Like, oh, right, I graduate high school. Like, oh, right, I go to college. Oh, right, I get married. I have kids. And we don't even realize how scripted our life really is. And I think for me, I think along with a lot of other humans, when COVID happened, it really slowed my life down incredibly. I have 4 kids. I'm part of a blended family. So, we have multiple households, driving kids, school schedules, custody schedules. My partner is still a university professor. I was at the time a university professor. And so we just spent a lot of time driving and going and doing. And, when you're driving and going and doing, you don't spend a lot of time like, how do I actually feel like what, and what's here when we slow down and we stop. And it was such a gift because my 2 stepchildren who spend time evenly between households, their parent was still required to do their job, not for the whole of COVID, but for at least the second half of when we were on lockdown. And so we had my stepchildren here every day for school, and we had my bio kids here, and my research had slowed down. My partner's research had slowed down. And so we were all just kind of in the house with each other. And it really gave me an opportunity to explore some things I already knew about my life, but just never had time to fully turn towards. Why have some things followed me into my second marriage? Why, why is my husband's relationship with his ex so different than the relationship with my ex? Why does my husband orient towards people so differently than I orient towards people. Just our whole worldviews were so different. And those differences just kept becoming more and more obvious to me. And, I wasn't actually in a dark place when kind of some of my pivots happened, which is interesting. I mean, I have been in some dark places, but I think just dispositionally, I'm very much a pull yourself up, like just keep working. If you work hard, you'll solve the problem. And so I think work was always my road out of crisis. Like I had a fairly successful academic career. But then when that was gone, I was like, well, there's nothing really to work on right now.
So did you leave, or did COVID kind of shut things down? So that,
COVID just shut
yeah.
things down. Like
Okay.
my research was all human. So yeah, it was like in schools, in classrooms, my teaching was all in person. And so it was just so much. And my kids were now home. So it was everything just slowed down and shut down, which
What were
gave
you
me,
in? What field?
I'm in psychology and
Huh?
educational psychology. And so I think at that point, there was just this kind of loose call to start sharing a lot of what I knew about developmental psychology and what I learned from, being married twice and parenting. But yet I wouldn't have said I was doing trauma inspired work at that time. It was just like, I have so much knowledge. I want to share it. Academia is so rule based. You can only do certain things. Everything has to have evidence. And so I started with a podcast actually. And the podcast was just talking about marriage, having guests on talking about marriage. And I think as I went behind a microphone, all of a sudden I felt this freedom, and I couldn't even like see the people I was speaking to, which was really interesting because I'm so used to you're in front of people, you're seeing the people, they're asking you questions, you can see their responses. Are they resonating? Are they not? Are they about to critique you? Are they not? But in this place in my home behind a microphone where I didn't even know who I was speaking to, I just started speaking more and more truth into my experience and pulling some strands through of mentorship and coaching, which was part of my job before. It just wasn't, highlighted as prominently as the research, but I taught, I mentored. So my favorite parts of my job were the coaching of graduate students. And I got on Instagram. I started speaking there, and kind of just an audience came. And then from there, I was like, well, I think I want to do this full time. Like, I think I don't want to go back. And I remember the exact moment I was on a walk in 2021, the summer, and it was just so clear. I'm like, I'm not going back. And no one could believe it because my whole life was around the academy. My husband's life is around the academy. It was so core to who I thought I was, but it was so clear I was not going back, and I was going to turn towards the online coaching business, being a content creator, being a podcaster, just full time. And so it
Yeah. Did
really
you
was.
find in the academic world that like that model is structured in a way that sometimes you can't be creative. Sometimes you're limited, right, by policy or by, the rigidity of the curriculum of maybe in a higher level learning, it's not as much. But I love that the podcast idea was just a different medium for you to do what you're already doing, but
Yeah.
in a way that could touch more, because also your audience is limited, right?
I
And
think the big difference is that there was two. I mean, there's a lot, but there's two. And there's also a lot of similarities, but the two differences are when you are a content creator, you have an audience that's opting into what you're offering versus a
yes,
lot of what I was doing teaching, especially in a helping discipline like education. Students had to take my classes. They were
right.
requirements for certification. They were requirements for the doctoral program. And so I felt like I didn't even realize it until I started teaching in kind of choice-based context, that I spent so much energy trying to convince people that what I was telling them was important. So there's a lot of convincing energy in the academy. Prove it, like make it relevant. It's so draining in a lot of ways. I didn't really realize until I stepped away. And then I
Yeah,
think
that's so true.
when it comes
Good
to
point. Yeah.
research, it's really conservative in research, understandably, because the bridge you can make between what we know, and I put that in quotes, and what the evidence is that supports our current theories, you can only take a baby step in a direction, because you can't take a huge leap because people are thinking, oh, that's unfounded. How did you take that big leap? Research is a lot of incremental knowledge limited by what we can perceive in the world. I remember I saw a tweet one time from a researcher I absolutely love, and she's the founder of critical race theory. And, she'd been talking about it since the 60s, like a long time, 70s, probably not 60s, like 70s. And then there was this study probably like 10 years ago, funded by the government, that proved some of the findings she had theoretically. And she tweeted, she's like, I'm glad my theory is real now. And like cited the study. So there is that kind of necessary carefulness, but it also limits creativity and what can count as what we know, So, yes.
So how did you niche down into trauma? What led to that discovery? And that's where you wanted to go and help people with.
I think it kind of started by just finding my voice, just finding my voice, getting more and more comfortable speaking my truth. And then I think it just evolved from there. And then I think it was kind of how what we're interested in aligns with what we're good at. And I think with complex trauma, it's interesting to really work through and heal trauma. I think there's a structure that needs to be in place, and there's things you actually need to move through both internally and externally. And so I think my researcher's mind and kind of my educator's understanding of how do you create development over time, I knew I wanted to heal my own complex trauma. And so I was just like, okay, what do? You look at the research, what works, what doesn't, and you want to create a transformation. You line up a scope and sequence of things that people need to move through. And that just made so much sense to me. But I don't think that often people think developmentally about a problem, but that's how I've trained. That's what I've done for so long, that came really naturally to me. So then when I realized the people need this, they don't want to just go to a therapist for 50 minutes every week and no one's really holding them between sessions or helping them do independent work or giving them milestones. Like, if this is true, you're healing, like, but also not so rigid that it's a checklist,
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So talk about what CPTSD is. So tell the audience kind of its specialized, area, and you just discovered it as you were, I don't know, how did you discover it?
I don't think it's that specialized. So I think actually a lot more people than realize experience complex trauma. And so I think, one way, if a listener's listening, like, oh, like, is this me? I'm going to explain two things that I think really help people resonate. Is this connected to me? So I think if you're someone that has had chaotic or confusing relationships that you never settle into a comfort with intimacy, it always feels like there's tension or there's push pull or there's just nothing ever settles. And you're someone who, wants to be close to people, wants to feel love, wants to feel held and just settled in a family, but yet it never really settles for you. There's always some sadness, there's always some pain, there's always some hurt, and that feels kind of perpetual. And you can numb it by working or drinking or, having an affair, like there's an escape from it. But when you come back to your life, you don't want to be in it. And that kind of keeps following you around no matter what happens. You get the promotion, you get the job, you get the child, like whatever it is, it just is persistent in your life. So I feel like if you're listening and that feels like you, then I'm going to tell you kind of how that comes to be. And if that resonates with you, then I would Google complex trauma. And Pete Walker's book, we can link it in your show notes. It's kind of the starting place for people, I think. So like when you're a kid, right? All kids have stressful things happen. I mean, like, we're human, right? So life is not this perfect place for us. So if you think about a kid, and I don't know if you'll show some video of this, but I'll kind of walk it through, but I'm kind of using my hand to show like a baseline. So you're here, you're a kid, and you're going to be out in the world, and then something's going to happen. And the stress of the environment. So now I'm using my other hand above it. So there's a gap. Now the stress of your environment is outpaced your skills as a kid. So this could be a teacher calls you out and says, okay, share your work. And you're like, I don't understand it. And then you share your work in a class, and then a kid just makes like, oof, not the right answer, as like that. Or someone breaks up with you suddenly, you're all getting ready for, a big dance. And then you get, what now would be a text message. When I was growing up would be a telephone call or a note or something, but you get word that this person actually has broken up with you and they're actually in love with your best friend and they're taking them to the dance, not you. I mean, these things happen, right? A grandparent dies suddenly, and the last time you talked to them, you were kind of a rude teenager. You weren't kind to them, and then they die, and you think, oh my gosh, I didn't have this moment with them. So these events happen in our life that are just normal kid events, and it's not the event that is traumatizing. It's like what happens afterwards. And so good enough parents will either build up the resiliency of their kid by helping them co-regulate or reframe something, or kind of give them an internal sense of, you've got this. Like, I'm going to teach you how to self-protect, how to apologize, how to forgive, really important developmental milestones we have to move through. And it's kind of this survival code of like, lean in when in distress to connect, and it will be better. And then they try to reduce the stress of the environment. So now I'm moving down my top hand. So they close the gap for their kid. They raise the coping skills. They decrease the stress. Now they don't fix it for them, because that would be just reducing the stress of the context without raising the skills. The kid goes to another environment, parents not there, they don't know how to do it themselves. So it's really both reducing the stress of the environment and increasing coping skills. Now, in a tricky family, that doesn't always happen. So like the gap is still there, and it's like, oh, we don't communicate well. You didn't really teach me what I needed. There's some stuff to work out. In a traumatizing family, it's not just that the gap isn't closed, it's actually your parents widen the gap. So they either critique you, attack you, distance from you when something goes wrong. So your skill set's actually depressed, going down, because it's you don't even have someone helping you. Now you think, oh my gosh, something's really wrong with me. Like, I caused this. I don't know what to do. I'm unlovable. I'm not worthwhile. That decreases. And often they're bringing their own patterns of relating, their own unhealed trauma, and they're increasing the crisis. Like, they don't know how to cope with a crisis. They make a small thing into a crisis. They're actually increasing the stress of your environment. And
The
when that
parents.
happens,
Yeah.
the parents, yeah,
Yeah.
when that happens again and again and again, that really relates to complex trauma. And the one thing I really want your my goodness, listeners, I was just doing a written thing, listeners to feel is that one of the biggest myths about trauma, and I think we're rewriting this right now, and this is so my personal mission, is that in past years, because I think it's really taboo to hold parents responsible, and a lot of parents in certain racial categories or certain socioeconomic categories have been off the table or off the target or off the focus for how they're causing trauma. And so what we have is a historical record of research that really focuses on quite extreme traumas and only labels those as traumas. So if you look at the adverse like inventories of childhood experiences, those events are quite extreme and don't apply a lot to what I'm talking about in terms of psychological safety, emotional safety, spiritual safety, sexual safety, which takes a lot of parents off the hook and really focuses our policy and our resources on a specific set of parents that are pretty vulnerable and easy to target, honestly. So there's a lot of equity and justice issues related to this that are kind of on the underbelly of my message, which is a lot of people suffer from complex trauma that are not currently identified as such. But as soon as they hear me speak the words I just spoke around the gap, parents making it worse, my relationships feel that way. They resonate.
I have a question. Is this typically like repeated, like incidences, like over time? Because, it's funny. I ask this because I'm 63, and I look back and I think I never had any trauma. I had a wonderful life. I had parents who loved me very much. But in the past year, as I've been doing more work on myself, digging into like these like certain like, and it's not necessarily something that prevents me from, because I feel like I'm living my best life right now and I'm very happy, but there's just little things like sometimes I get really afraid of people judging me. And that's like something there. Well, why can't I be free of judgment? Why can't I like think differently about like, why am I worried about what people think? And so in the past year, a few things have come up. And one of them was my mom was anorexic. And so when she was pregnant with me, she didn't gain any weight. Well, she gained like 8 pounds. You couldn't tell she was pregnant. I was born prematurely. And I think it was because failure to thrive. But then like just recently I was with my coach and I had this like aha moment that when I was like 8 years old, I a classmate's dad died and I became obsessed with death and I got obsessive compulsive disorder. And so, but I hid it and I didn't tell my parents, but there was things that I did. Like every night I would ask my mom the same 3 questions and she never really talked to me about it. You know, she never, she got to the point where she'd come in and to my bedroom and she'd say, yes, yes, no, yes, yes, no. And so she wouldn't even like give me the time of day. It was just like, she was, she was busy and she was distracted with, her job and my dad, and she was in school at night. And then while we were talking, another trauma just came up. And that was, I broke and dislocated my finger and they didn't take me to the doctor. Because they were having a party. And so they were drinking and having fun with their friends. I came home from a friend's house and my finger was over on the other side of my other finger. And my dad tried to put it back into place. My dad's not a doctor. And then I went to bed like that. And I woke up in the morning with like still like that. And I think the doctor was like shocked when we went to the doctor. So there's just like these little things. Like I look back in my life, I felt loved by my parents, but there was these little, very separate and a lot of time between them. But actually, these incidences all happened when we lived in this one house for like 4 years. So they were, well, not the pregnancy, but being afraid of death, getting OCD, and then my finger. And so that's kind of was a very compressed. And I was from 8. We lived there from the time I was 8 to when I was just turning 12. So I was curious, is like,
yeah. So
what
two
is,
things.
yeah.
Two things I would say. So one thing I would say is, let's see. I'll start with this one, even though I want to say the other one first. I think from a listener's perspective, this will land first. When people are trying to feel like what's the difference between a tricky family and a traumatizing family, because like I said, unicorn parents are very rare where it's not tricky or not traumatizing. That's just the truth. It might change with my kids because I feel like there's a lot more information about like emotional intelligence and mental health. So I think that actually will change a little bit. But I think for our generations, like if you're like 35 and above, you probably had a tricky family or traumatizing family, or you lucked out and got a unicorn family. I one of the ways that I resonate, and this comes by way of kind of noticing my husband's interactions with his family and my interactions with my family. In a traumatizing family, the best way I can describe it is there's no floor. Like there's no bottom that you could hit where you can't expect something else to happen. Whereas in a tricky family, it's like we may disagree, we may not talk for 3 weeks. I may give you the silent treatment in a really like kind of toxic way, or we might pretend this thing didn't happen that did, and that's problematic. I mean, and we know when things come down to it, and it gets really bad, of course, we're going to be there. We're family. We love you. Where I think in a traumatizing family, there is no floor. You're like, yep, my mom cut me out right before my husband died. Yep, that makes sense. Like there's no floor to it. That's like, it's a hard thing to articulate, but that's the only way I can describe it. And I feel like if people resonate with that and they hear that, they think, oh my goodness, that's my family. There is no floor. There is no bottom we can hit where someone will scoop you up and say, of course, we're family. We're not going to let that happen. And that's the big difference.
Yeah, I love your labels. They're so clear. So what, did your husband have a unicorn family? Is it?
No, I would say
No.
they skew towards tricky.
And yours are the
Definitely traumatizing. Yeah.
traumatizing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I would just say the other thing, and this is kind of also part of the ecosystem of a tricky family. A mom with anorexia is kind of tricky. I mean, there was something going on with her that she had protective parts of her, protective energy that really was feeding her these messages of you must control, you must be perfect to be loved. You must control, you must be perfect to be loved, because that's the anorexic protective part. You must control to be safe, you must perfect to be loved. And so while that was going on, especially in a pregnancy where there's all this like womb energy and like great mother energy that should be flowing through that, that's like a disconnection of the mother line. So there's definitely stuff there, I would say, and only you kind of understand, but I do, just to kind of name something for you, I have a lot of people that enter into my space that, you know, have said, I professed my love for my parents. I would have said I had the perfect family. I would have said I was loved as a kid. And yet it's undeniable what I experience. And now that you're talking to me, and so I do just want to name for listeners and for you, there is such a taboo against speaking our truth. And I think it's because, and this is something I've been trying to kind of correct in my own journey, is that when I first started speaking openly, I think I had parts of me that were so angry at my parents. And so, I mean, just compounded anger over so many years of things that I really did speak out in a way that was not compassionate towards, particularly my mom. And I really do regret that. That was not the way forward, I believe, but I didn't have models in the survivor community, because a lot of the survivor community is very righteously angry, which I now understand is also a protective part of people, because I think when we're really tapped into the divine in all of us and the deep source energy and self energy, you can kind of arrive at this space of, I hold you accountable for what you did to me, and I love you and I forgive you. And forgiveness is a very controversial topic in the survivor community, but there's a path forward where you can hold your parents accountable and still kind of be in the frequency of love and compassion. It's kind of a nuanced place to be, but it exists. And I think that's where a lot of models of recovery and trauma survivors have that very edgy, righteous, call it out, speak my truth, that is a hard place to be. So I think you can tell your own story, hold your parents accountable, and still love and be compassionate. It's going to change your relationship with them for sure. It should. I mean, it absolutely should change your relationship with them, but changes aren't bad or wrong. Sometimes changes are really empowering and beneficial to both and everybody, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you feel like sharing? And of course you don't have to, like some examples of what no bottom is like in your life. What were some
Yeah. I
things?
can give a really concrete example with my ex-husband, who's also a trauma survivor. No bottom is, we were negotiating, we have a legal custody agreement, and anyone who's divorced has a custody agreement knows that they're kind of just words on paper, because to get them enforced, it's almost impossible to, I mean, not impossible, but it has to get really bad for you to find yourself in front of a judge. And by the time you do, it's probably whatever's happened is already passed. So divorced parents that are co-parenting with a custody agreement are going to relate to that reality. However, most adults kind of take the custody agreement as sacred. Like, we agreed to this, we wrote it down, we had lawyers, like, this is our plan. When we don't agree, we fall back on this document. So my ex and I were negotiating a trip he wanted to take. The girl, one of my children, had an event that they would have to miss if they went on the trip. And it was my custody time. So I said, you can't take them. Like, I don't want them to miss this event. They don't want to miss this event. It's important. You'll have to reschedule this event. And it wasn't for his family. It was for their stepmom, which is, blended. Like, I'm a stepmom too. Like, I get it, but I also think it wasn't for his family. It was for her family. They were missing an event. I'm like, I don't agree with this. It's my call. I'm doing it. He bought the tickets anyway. He bought the tickets anyway. And at that point, plane tickets, told the girls, canceled the thing. And I was like, well, what can I do? Like, you've bought the tickets. Like, you've given me no option here. I can't go in front of a judge. You backed me into this corner about this thing I feel important about. And so it's that. And then when I try to have an exchange with him about it, text message, like, this wasn't right, what you did, what comes back is very vicious. Like, I don't need to repeat everything, but attacking me, attacking my worth, trying to tell me I'm a horrible person, and so it's just so, it's like, well, there's nowhere to go. I just have to walk away from this. So I think that's one example that feels, I mean, there's probably a lot more, but I think that's it. I think when you're down or there's a disagreement, people are going to do what's best for them with no regard for your well-being or health. And then when you say, this hurts, this isn't right, they don't even distance or consider it. They attack you for expressing your side of it.
Yeah. Did you feel as a child that you weren't like cared for? Do you not have the same perspective? Like, even though I had these incidences, but I still felt like I was loved. Did you feel like you weren't loved as a child? Or,
It's so tricky to go back and reconstruct. Like, I mean,
mm-hmm,
did I even know what love was at 11? Or, I mean, I knew things weren't right. I mean, I can
mm.
say that I knew things weren't right. And
And a
I
lot of
just
kids
didn't
don't.
know.
They
I
don't
just didn't.
know. Yeah. Until they go
Yeah.
somewhere else and see it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I knew something wasn't right. I didn't know what was not right. It took me a little bit to piece together what wasn't right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that I've interviewed people and they're like, you might, it was really, my upbringing was not normal. And I didn't know that until I started to visit friends like in middle school. And I saw
Yeah.
like, is that they're nice to each other. They have dinner together. They compliment each other. So yeah.
Yeah. I think my experience and a lot of my clients' experience is a little bit different in that, people in trauma ecosystems tend to attract other people in trauma ecosystems. And so a lot of my friends kind of had similar dynamics. A lot of my significant others, partners also kind of had that similar dynamic. And so what they were reflecting back felt very familiar to me. So I think that's the hardest thing, is what's going to be the mirror back to you that this isn't normal. There's something different. It's sometimes people don't get that mirror.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, my mom was the child of a alcoholic, and there was like two generations prior to her that were alcoholics. So there was a lot of like what you had referred to earlier, where not speaking, like cutting people off.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my mom's sister was cut off from the family for 7 years. And
Yeah.
so they didn't speak. They, a letter, and then that was it. And yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, just hearing that, sounds like your parents did better than what they had
Yeah.
received. But maybe not, as good as it could have been with some support. I think that's the interesting thing about intergenerational trauma. Like, how does it get passed on? Who's the actual cycle breaker? And so much of it is so situational. I mean, you are the child of someone with unhealed trauma, but you happen into a friend group in college that's really healthy just by circumstance because they lived on your dorm floor. You meet a best friend, you get taken into their family, you realize you get in a support group, you marry a partner who's not a trauma survivor. I mean, that's a totally different trajectory for you versus someone who ends up taking a job in a restaurant. They meet somebody who's also a trauma survivor, and then it kind of like, then they end up getting, pregnant and having a baby. And now you're taking care of a baby. So you don't end up finishing college. I mean, it's like things can just spiral really quickly upward or downward in how these all things play out. So I think that's also kind of the developmental perspective on it too, of it's not just this formula you can plug people in to see the outcome. There's so many different factors that influence things.
Yeah. And so heading into a different topic,
Yeah.
it was kind of related, but because I mean, I'm curious what tools you use, because when I see you on Instagram, you're clearly like, I think you work in the energy of,
Yeah. I mean, I'm
eh,
pretty big into energy and just
yeah.
I mean, it's a good way to talk about trauma because trauma is definitely like an energetic imprint. Yeah. I
So
didn't
what are
mean to
some
cut you off.
tools
Yeah.
like you that have helped you? I saw that you had your human design profile you posted. I
Yeah.
recently did that last year. So that's been really eye-opening for me, because I have done and made decisions in my life that are completely in opposition to my human design.
Yes. It is kind of interesting when you do that. I mean,
Yes.
so the primary tool that I've used since I left the academy, I've been so fortunate. I mean, it feels like this really is a divine intervention. Internal family systems is a particular kind of modality, and it's very hard to get into the trainings. And, many people wait. It's so popular. There's actually a lottery to apply, so you can't
Oh,
even just apply. They pull a lottery, tell you if you can apply, and then you get in. And I it was introduced to IFS, which is what you call it shorthand, on my own podcast. I interviewed somebody really fascinating. I tried it out on my own. It changed my life personally. So I was like, well, I'm going to apply for level 1. And I got it the first time. I mean, it was just crazy. And then, internal family systems, I got trained in level 1. And then I applied for level 2 and I'm going in March. It's wild. I don't understand how this is happening, but it's so good because I just love internal family systems. But from my perspective, it's not complete. So if I had to kind of describe what I combine, it's internal family systems, kind of goddess archetypal energy, and shamanic journeying. And those together really make a really nice kind of space to do transformative work in my mind. And I don't hold any of them super tightly. I think as a good coach or mentor, you're always innovating and intuitively guiding and just pulling in what feels resonant for your client. You're just like, oh,
yeah.
this feels relevant, So I'm definitely an innovator when it comes to coaching. But those are the 3 things that I would say I kind of anchor in. Yeah.
That's awesome. So is there a level 3? What's the highest level that you
There's
can
a
get to?
level 3. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. And how
Yeah.
long does each level take you to go through?
So they usually do them in intensive weekends. One is the longest. I think there's 4-day intensives, and they're 9 to 5. I mean, you're there. It's intense. And what's so interesting about IFS, unlike other trainings, is you actually practice. So you are like in triads, and at one point you're the client, the other person's the therapist. And so you actually practice while someone supervises you, which is really
That's
fascinating.
great. That's the
Yeah.
best way to learn. Do you do retreats?
It's interesting you asked this because I've been planting seeds for an in-person retreat center. So I live outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm not from here, but this is where I ended up. And I am planting seeds for a retreat center in West Virginia because
Oh,
there's some
I live in Virginia.
beautiful,
I'm
yeah,
coming. I'm
you
signing
come,
up.
yes. There's some beautiful land in West Virginia. And so I've been kind of eyeing, I have a must-have list for a piece of property. And so I think the property and the timing will align and I'll do it.
And so will you move from Pittsburgh to West Virginia?
No, we'll stay here. I'll just use it as, a close enough commute to travel down there and be
Maybe
there.
other people can use it as a venue as well. I
I'm
don't know.
too energetically. No way. I would never trust anyone else's
Don't
energy.
bring your dark energy here.
No, I actually appreciate dark energy and welcome it in all my spaces. But I think just wanting to make sure that whatever energy is brought into the space, dark or not, like doesn't matter. I welcome all energies that I know what's been there, so I can clear it and keep it pure. So it's more of that kind of thing.
And I'm just curious, did you do any of this or know any of this as a professor? Were you interested in this like energy work before?
Not at all. It's only when I started healing and being like, what's going to work? Yeah. And it
Yeah,
really
that's
was like a what's going to work framework, which is interesting because any person who's deep into energy would be like, that's the oddest place to come to energy. I'm like, what's going to work?
that's right. That's
Not
right.
very, not very,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Let me be intuitively guided versus,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, Yeah, this is fascinating. I think you're a great example of what I like to tell people is that you're never too old to develop new skills. You're never too
Oh,
old to, explore and discover and use that. People think, oh, I need to develop that within myself, but what you learn is so valuable. If it helps you, it's going to help other people, right?
and I think it's actually a remembering. I don't think they're things that are new. I think
Mm,
they're things we remember that were there all along and we forgot because we didn't tend to them and no one helped us tend to them. Because I can remember being a little girl and biking to my public library and sitting in the self-help aisle and like poring over like astrology books. But I just, I lost that along the way. And I mean, I don't give my power away to those things, but I think they're fun to play in as alternative ways of knowing or just seeing what that brings to us. But I think there's a lot of people that would say it's just a remembering. I remembered I love music. I remembered I love to use my hands to work with wood. I remember I love to solve problems. I remember I like to organize things. I remember I
yeah.
like to plan the birthday party.
Yeah.
You know, we
Yeah.
just we just forget along the way. So for me, it feels more like a remembering
Yeah.
versus something new.
Yeah. So good. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. And I'm so glad we finally got our schedules together because we didn't
I
have to research it.
agree.
Yes,
I
yes.
agree.
So let's keep in touch. Is there any last bit of just inspiration you'd like to share about, I like to say living a spark life, you're clearly sparked, you're energetically aligned, and I love your calmness. You feel
Mm,
very calm when I talk to you. I like that when I have guests on. I kind of
yes.
go away like, ah, like I
That's
had a
so
nice
good.
bath.
I love that. That's such a compliment. I received that. I
Yeah.
received that. I think it's just, what I would leave, given your audience on this podcast, I would just really give everyone full permission who's listening to this that if you ever hear a podcast episode or read something or hear something, and it does spark this remembering of, I like this, I resonate with this, pay attention. It's, something came across your path to remind you and follow that interest and just let it not be something you do, but let it just be an open inquiry. There's no timeline, there's no gold star for listening to all the podcasts or reading all the books. It's more just an open invitation to keep it alive in your life and keep getting curious about it. And eventually it will lead you down the path that will help you see what it was meant to teach you or show you. I think
That's
that's what I would
great.
leave
I
with.
mean, that hits home because that was me. And I was 59 at the time, and I heard somebody's name, and somebody was like, "Oh, he's my coach, he's my mentor, he's great." And so I Googled him and I found out he had a podcast and I started listening to it, and I kept tuning in. I never really was a podcast listener,
Mm,
but I never wanted to miss his because he had the best combination of smartness. He's a business coach, smartness,
yeah.
and humor,
Hmm.
and woo, and I was like really interested in the woo, and I was like, ooh,
Yes.
and inside of me, I remembered when I back worked in the corporate world as an executive that I never thought I could, people would leave and start their businesses because I worked for a startup, and they'd leave and start their own businesses, and
Hmm.
I admired them, but I also thought I could never do that. I could never
Mm.
do that, but I think I had a deep desire to do that. And so when I found him and I connected with this podcast and I started hearing things, it kind of brought that up, and it made me start to believe that I could. And so it's so
So
interesting that you said that.
powerful.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so powerful. I mean, the podcast space is so powerful. I mean, the fact that you could just, I mean, I have people all the time come into my world and be like, I don't even know how I found your podcast, but I started listening and then I binged it all weekend and here I am. I mean, it just really can shift your perspective because it can be that mirror. Remember, we were talking about earlier, you can't see what you can't see. You need someone to hold up a mirror or hold up or show you a path, whatever the metaphor is, and then you see the path or then you reflect back, oh, and I love you said humor because nothing is as good when you have your headphones on or AirPods in and you're literally laughing out loud and people are looking at you like, what are you laughing about? And you're just in the moment with a host on a podcast. It's so fun to laugh out loud when you're listening to someone's podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I love it. So anyways, thank you so much, Tanner. And we'll stay in touch. I'm really
absolutely.
interested in your retreat. So I need to get on your list.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning into the Not Your Average Lives podcast. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe on iTunes if you have an Apple device. You can find free resources and learn what else I have going on at the moment that might interest you on my website at notyouraverage.grandma.com. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook at notyouraverage.grandma. If you liked this episode, it would make my heart so happy if you could leave me a 5-star rating. You can also add a review to let me know what you like about this podcast, which will help spread the word about it to others who need a little midlife inspiration. As always, be you, listen to your inner voice, and focus on reigniting that lost spark so you can start living your own, not your average life.